Here's a brief list of just some of what you can expect from the world of Anbennar. Mongolians who ride terror birds. A halfling shire that waters their fields with blood. Hobgoblin samurai, state-mandated orc girlfriends, divine house cats who will burn down entire cities if you don't give them enough treats, a forest that hates us, and an elf so attracted to harpies that he's turned it into a religion. The best D&D setting I've come across in the last few years comes from an unexpected direction. Europa Universalis 4 is a grand strategy game set during the Age of Discovery, when Europeans began to explore and colonize the world. The grand strategy genre, for the uninitiated, is a type of strategy game set on a national scale. They're map games where you control entire nations at once. They're not quite a simulation usually, but they're also a lot less gamey than 4X games, and they are rather infamous for their difficulty to learn, simply because of how much complexity and depth they typically contain. Paradox's grand strategy games tend to have some incredible modding scenes with impossibly well-made custom worlds. You may have heard of Kaiserreich, the famous alternate World War II mod for Hearts of Iron. Or maybe you've spotted news articles about the Game of Thrones mods for the Crusader Kings games that really let you dive into the intrigue in a way that no other Game of Thrones game would ever let you do. Or, if you found this video, you may have spotted a recent video by Soul Tomato about the appallingly grimdark Crusader Kings 3 mod, Godherja. Maybe Godherja? It's hard to find pronunciation guides on languages that are made up. These are worlds built by hundreds of people working in collaboration and built up over years of writing, rewriting, and taking feedback from the community. Contributors write and design content that then gets approved and reviewed by veteran team members with a ton of lore expertise. Oftentimes, these modders end up becoming real code wizards in their own right, creating content that far outstrips the quality of the base game. But more than that, a well-administered writing team on these mods, with a good approval and review process, is capable of such depths of world building that it can honestly send the fantasy greats running for their money. So when Anbennar, a custom fantasy world explicitly based on Dungeons & Dragons, started getting that exact same hyper-detailed, hyper-deep treatment, that's a colossal deal that really deserves the D&D community's attention. These aren't off-the-cuff or superficial similarities to D&D, by the way. J-Bean, the original creator and head developer, flat out says, if it exists in D&D, it probably exists somewhere in some form in Anbennar. This is a fan-made D&D setting, and there are plenty of people in the Discord who are using it for exactly that purpose. In addition to the use as an EU4 mod, this property straddles both sides of the digital divide. Anbennar is one of those settings that's impossible to explain in only one video. It's so lore-dense that it might actually be bigger than any officially produced D&D setting. And it's also not so thematically tight that I could give it a base summary with any speed, a la Dark Sun or The Hollow World. In-game, Anbennar progresses over 400 years of history after you hit Start, as we take a world that starts out akin to the Forgotten Realms, and we end up in a world that looks a lot more like Eberron. Now, listen, if at the end of all this you end up wanting to play an Anbennar tabletop game, you can find some homebrew assets and some playgroups in their Discord. But if you want to flesh out a fan-made setting like this, then you might want to check out today's sponsor, Chepeku, to breathe life into your tabletop maps and visuals. Chepeku is a tabletop titan with a library of thousands of ready-to-go maps of all kinds for your tabletop games. They've got battle maps, they've got city maps, dungeon maps, they're printable, they're compatible with virtual tabletops, and some, yes, your eyes are not deceiving you, some of them are even animated. Now let's poke through the Chepeku library and let's see if we can't find some good Anbennar set pieces. Well, we definitely want the Dwarven Hall map for your games playing as Dwarven Reclaimers in the Serpent Spine. And, as you can see, it's got a lot of variations for each hold you could find yourself in, including this one here for when you first arrive, and it's all swarming with goblins. And, oh my, did your adventuring company get lost in the deep woods? Well, how about the Depths of Festerwood map? Customizable for whatever Feylord you decide to use to bully your players. Okay, how about this? Do you want to subject your players to the actual historical events of Anbennar before we hit play? How about we use the Banshee Moor map, and we subject your players to an orcish charge at the Battle of Rottenstep? Chapekku has everything you need to take this setting from its collaborative fiction roots and bring it into being before the very eyes of your players. So, let's say you're interested. How do you gain access? Well, you're gonna sign up to their Patreon at the Master Cartographer tier. This gets you access to their entire library of maps instantly. All of them, thousands, with variations like day and night cycles. And if you go one tier up from all this, you'll gain access to a monthly animated map too. Another big thanks to Chapekku for bringing all manners of tabletop settings to life. Now, let's return to Anbennar. I love Anbennar, and I play so much of this in my off hours. I don't even play regular Europa Universalis 4 anymore. The game exists purely to host Anbennar. So here's what we're doing. It's too big of a world to just try to lore dump right here at the beginning like I usually do. Instead, we're going to play 3 different campaigns of Anbennar, and I'm going to give you the background lore that is required leading up to each one of these stories that we'll be playing through. All of this combined together ought to give you a good idea of what type of world this is and how it all works. Now keep in mind, I might end up making some mistakes here. This is a very difficult IP to find a bunch of lore on, because it's spread across hundreds of in-game mission trees, small wiki articles, in-house lore primers on the Discord, as well as just having to ask the writers about some things. I am able to put this video together because I have been obsessed with this property for 3 years. But even so, I might misremember something I read 2 years ago and can't track down again. Or I might cite some lore that has since been retconned, or place too much emphasis on details that are considered to be just an in-universe theory. If you're one of the devs and you notice that I've made an error, please sound off in the comments and give us the correction. But otherwise, let's accept that what I'm about to regale you all with is just my understanding of D&D's Paradox mod, as a guy who has played a lot of it. Let's begin at the heart of the story, Escan, the land of adventurers and the ruins of an empire. The day before the mod starts, a hero died, and when we hit play, she shall rise again, a war goddess that will bathe a continent in blood. Let's start with a band of adventurers called the Corintar, they who just saved the world from the Green Tide. The lands of Escan that the Corintar occupy have a long history, and most of it is important to explain exactly how we got here. Escan is just a nickname. It means East Canor, which is the continent we're on. But this place, it has a proper name too, a name that only applies when it's united. They call it Castanor, the greatest human empire that Canor has ever known. And you may have already noticed, there's going to be a lot of CA names in this section. I apologize, I didn't choose this. There was a guy named Castan, and he named literally everything. I'm sorry, let's just make the best of it. Humanity's long history began in Bulwar, a land of sand and oasis. Fate had never been kind to humanity in Bulwar, spending their long history alternating between being vassals of genies or enslaved to gnolls, or in those rare situations where humanity did have independence, they would often be ruled by tyrannical god kings. Some humans managed to find a better way, however, making a home for themselves on the banks of a vast fertile river called the Mother's Sorrow. There they found a more gentle taskmaster, the Ket, a godlike race of divine cats who pledged to allow the settlers to prosper as stewards of the Sorrow. In exchange for these stewards, bringing them an unending tribute of luxury for their pleasure barges. Literally just being a cat owner. In time, humanity's ill luck caught up with them once more, alongside catching up to the empire they built, called Keterata. It was sacked by the gnolls of the Great Jaz. Although Keterata would live on, subjugated by one master after another for a millennia after, our story instead follows a band of slaves who would use the disruption as their chance to flee and win their freedom. Among them was a man named Castan, who would name fucking everything after himself. We're gonna get there. The group of them fled north, the gnolls of the Jaz hot on their heels, itching to claim the refugees as slaves once more. The chase took them clear out of Bulwar, where it was hoped that the monster-infested Northlands would shake the hyenas off their tail. Instead, they were cornered at the Battle of Burning Hill. As though answering their prayers, a silver dragon protected the refugees, though failing to end the threat completely. The gnolls, it seemed, would happily chase the Exodites to the ends of the earth. Not even a dragon could put a stop to their voracious greed for slaves. The humans did the only thing they could to rid themselves of their pursuers, plunging headlong into the Fey-infested forest to the east. No one knows how long the Castanites wandered the deep woods, but the Fey have been known to hold mortals in their thrall for centuries. Castan came to lead his people in those woods, protecting them from the threats of the forest. In this hazy, wandering age, a way guide found Castan's people and led them to freedom. The way guide brought them north into fertile plains. Camp was made next to an idyllic lake, while Castan and his guide ascended the lone mountain to meet with the silver dragon that saved them many years ago. None truly know what happened at the top of the peak, but Castan returned, alone, distraught, and in possession of Kalendal, the Gleaming Blade. These events would come to be mythologized, with both the Way Guide and the Silver Dragon being lionized as the avatar of their people's savior deity, Castelos. From that day forward, every leader of the Castanites would ascend the mountain and return with the blade. Or they would not return at all. If they succeeded, they would be renamed Castan and rule their people. Yes, that's right, he even named all of the future kings after himself. As deeds became myth, so too did the camp become the city of Castonath. And the city became the empire of Castanor. I can't do this. I can't do this. This empire stretched across the continent and feuded with their rivals, the Gnomish hierarchy and the Demirian Republic. Castanor was very much the Rome of this setting, and like Rome, it has a legacy that isn't all black and white. They brought civilization, wealth, and built vast monuments across the continent. But so too did they bring destruction, with Castan Beastbane in particular, cleansing the continent of beast folk such as gnolls and centaurs. A lot happened. Wars, trade. There was a dynasty of Reavers who seized the throne of Castanor for a while. It was a complicated nation with a complicated history, but it would begin its decline on the Day of Ashen Skies. More on what that is when we do the second lore section, about the Elves. The Western Empire faded away as famine ravaged the continent, and eventually, after hundreds of years of decline, Castanor had been reduced to only its heartlands, Escan. The independent West began to prosper in its own right, countless kingdoms and republics in the style of Old Demiria. Metropolitan places full of halflings, dwarves, humans, gnomes. Not elves though, we'll get to the elves. Castanor may have been diminished with the years, but it was still the foremost of human kingdoms, the greatest power in Canor. And it would prove to have one last punch to throw at the world. Nichmur, the puppet master behind the current Castan, was revealed to be a witch. He seized the throne, and his black demons spread throughout the lands of the old empire, with armies led by the impossible magical prowess of his acolytes. A new, black Castanor began to expand. All across the continent, his dark legions conquered. Soon they would be in Demiria itself. The city of Anbencoast was under siege, and it became clear that humanity would find itself enslaved to a god king once more. But then, the elves arrived. None had seen such people like these before. Tall, lithe, beautiful, and proud. Tens of thousands of them were packed upon a fleet. They told stories of being adrift for 1,000 years, their homeland, Elantir, shattered in calamity on the day of ashen skies. Again, don't worry, we're gonna get to that in the next lore section. The Elves acted as the peacebringers, soothing the petty kingdoms and forging them into a last alliance against the Witch King Nichmor. As the tides turned, the gleaming army of elves leading the way, Nichmor was slain, and Castanor's 2,000 years history ended, though its people remained, forming into feudal kingdoms much like those in the West. The Griffin Riders of Marhold, the Blade Marches who held the Gleaming Blade, Adenica, the Heart of Chivalry, and Castellir, the rulers of Castanath. Out west, the elven generals were treated like saints for how they saved the world from evil. The generals carved up the continent and took their place atop human thrones with human spouses. As the centuries passed, the entire nobility of the continent would claim to be of elven descent. The truth, however, was that there's just too few elves to have made much of a genetic dent. Most of the rulers are just pure-blooded humans who insist that they are for sure half-elves. A few elven glades were formed as enclaves, but those too would begin to decline and come under human influence. Most are gone, and by the time the game starts, there are only a few independent elf realms in all of Canor. In the peacetime, many of these scattered kingdoms ruled by these half-elves of dubious elven ancestry ended up uniting themselves into a vast empire called Anbennar. And a few short centuries later, things begin to move again. The gnomes, exiled from their homeland on scattered islands after it had fallen to kobolds surging out of the mountains, prepared a revanchist campaign. Artificery was invented, the blending of magic and machine. The spark rifle was still centuries away from mass production, but the first muskets were produced just in time for the changing of the age. Wars in Escan had grown ritualistic, not decided by armies, but by the duels of great knightly champions. There were armies, but they existed almost entirely for show. It was the home of mighty warriors, but the truth of the matter is that Escan was fragile. The Serpent Spine Mountains, lost homeland of the Dwarves, had always been swarming with orcs, but they had been contained. Cugdir, the last dwarfhold in Canor, the fortress that had held for thousands of years, shattered. Millions of orcs, a green tide, came flooding into Escan, and chivalrous Escan, the final remnant of Castanor, was swallowed and crushed beneath orcish boots. At their head was Corgus Dukinson, an orcish witch king who could give Nichmor himself a run for his money. Escan was shattered, albeit not quickly. The orcs were here for a reason. For thousands of years, they swarmed through the mountains searching for their imprisoned god, Dukin. Corgus was born as a sort of messianic prophet, teaching his people that Dukin must in fact be held prisoner by the surface gods worshipped by humanity. Nearly 20 years after they emerged from the Serpent Spine, the humans of Escan had all been slaughtered or displaced until nothing was left but a league of hiding counts and the Griffin Riders of Marhold locked up in their mountain fortress. No help had come from the Western Kingdoms, for they had been fighting the last great medieval war of the age, a dynastic war between Demiria and the vast elvenized kingdom of Laurent. In time, the Lilac Wars would end, with Demiria and the various constituent states of the Empire of Anbennar shattered, and Laurent ascendant. The many peoples of Canor turned their gaze east. Corgus and the Greentide were preparing to march west and win more great victories against the rest of humanity. The Western Kingdoms were too exhausted to do much about this, but the countless adventuring companies of the land set to work, calling themselves the Marchers. Let's enter in on one of these adventurers, one of these Marchers. Her name was Corin, and she was a squire from the Duchy of Benon. When the adventuring companies marched east to liberate Escan, she joined them alongside her lord and their army. She wasn't an adventurer, not yet anyway. But she was a marcher. On the other side of the pending conflict was a half-orc. Lothain was a young boy of great talent, the son of an Orcish warlord and a captured Demirian princess. Lothain remembered little of his mother, save that she was the only person who'd ever treated him with kindness, despite the horrors of her fate. Being only half-blooded, Lothain was reviled and abused. He attempted to overthrow his clan, but was imprisoned for it. Corin and the Marchers won many small victories against the unprepared orcs. The young squire proved herself a formidable soldier. It was she, in fact, that pulled the captive Lothain from a dark pit and offered him and his fellow half-orcs a place among the Marchers. Corin and the circle of heroes that were beginning to form around her were the first family that Lothain had ever known. The campaign continued, with Corin's circle growing with each victory. Sorrow's Day, the 4th of Ishtament, 1443. They would call it the Battle of Rotten Step. The Prince of Gawed and the Marquis of Arboran sent a combined force of 12,000 soldiers east, linking up with a like number of adventurers, Corin and Lothain among them. This was meant to be the battle where the Marchers would finally take on the Orc Horde directly. This was to be the battle where Korghos would die. The strategy was simple. Force the orcs to charge through the mud into the Marcher shield wall, then flank them with cavalry. On the other side was Korghos, with a horde 100,000 strong. Powerful though he was, he grew concerned about the Canorian defenses. He had a plan, although he knew it would cost a high price. Tens of thousands of orcs trudged through the rain and the muck, assailing the Marchers, but the defenses held, all according to plan. Orc flesh broke upon Canorian pikes, and their clubs and axes shattered against the shield wall. Thousands upon thousands of orcs died as the assault stretched long into the afternoon. Korghos was agape at how disciplined the Canorians were, and pulled his forces back, fleeing into the swamp. It was then that the Marchers fell for his ploy. The orcs were primitive, and the Marchers looked down their nose at the greenskins. The very idea that they could be outmatched hadn't crossed the minds of the vast adventuring host. They pursued into the swamp, breaking up into smaller segments to claim as many greenskin heads for their guildmaster or feudal lord as possible. The Orcish reserve sprang to life, enveloping the army, and now there was no shield wall, no more defenses to overcome, just dozens of pockets of men, trapped in the swamp and surrounded by orcs. It was a bloody and desperate battle. Soldiers slain beneath orcish axe, or knights drowned in the sticky mud. The Prince of Gawed's own head was separated from his shoulders by Korghos himself. Even so, the heavy-armed and armored knights soldiered on. Even as great heroes were slain, the forces held. A host of Laurentish adventurer knights soon managed a proper cavalry charge on one of the less sodden fragments of the field, and the tide once more began to turn in the Marchers' favor. When Korghos finally cut his losses and retreated from the disastrous battle, 10,000 Marchers, a full third of the host, was dead. Corin, the red-headed squire of Benon, among them. When the sun rose on the sodden and bloody battlefield, all hope seemed lost. The orcs were without end. They could stomach another loss like this, but the Marchers were not so fortunate. It would be hard to host a force this large again, especially with Gawed being unlikely to help. But then, the adventurers were gifted a miracle. Corin rose from the dead. She was different now. Not a human, not quite, not anymore, but instead the avatar of something greater. Castellos, the head of the Pantheon, once faced a rebellion by his brother, the war god Agrados. Castellos won this conflict, and Agrados's infernal pantheon fled to exile in the Hells. Corin awoke, now the avatar of Agrados. Not a thrall to his demonic form, but rather gifted his remaining powers in his war god aspect. From here, her legend began. Most kings and lords returned home, their losses too great to count. Corin's circle had to become its own army, gathering up minor guilds and uniting what was left of the Marchers. She and Lothain found the hidden survivors of the Count's League, treated with the daring Prince of Marhold, and even wandered into the deep woods themselves and slew the archfey that had been keeping its denizens trapped beneath a verdant veil. Corin, in time, had an army. Adventurers, lost wood elves, half-orcs, griffin riders, and the hardened woodsmen of the Count's League. They marched on the city of Castenath. Rottenstep had destroyed the Marchers' first army. Corin had given them a second chance to slay the Orcish Witch King. The battle was no clean affair or set piece of tactics and formations. This was a slog fought building to building, street to street, until at last, with thousands having paid for the chance with their lives, Lothain and Corin stood before Corgus. Avatar of Agrados or not, Corgus was a Witch King. Among the mightiest sorcerers the world had ever known, he focused his assault on Lothain, forcing Corin to use her divine power to defend him, and not herself. Corgus's axe tore through the squire-turned-avatar. It would be the second time she died. In her final moments, as the Witch King thought her dead, Corin used her supernatural strength to lash out one more time, killing Corgus before succumbing to her own wounds moments later. The green tide was over. Corin's circle had won the day. But for Lothain Bluetusk, this could never be a happy day. He was alone now, at the head of the Order. Most were too polite to ask about his newborn son, the half-orc with blazing red hair. And all of this is just the backstory to our campaign. The storyline actually begins the day after Corgus and Corin die. We're going to be playing as Corin's Circle, with Lothain as our leader, forced to find a place for ourselves in the ruins of Escan, a world without Corin. The game starts with Escan looking like so. The land isn't settled yet, not really. Instead, we control roving adventurer warbands fighting to settle down in orc territory. But that won't be for a while. In fact, it's going to be decades of skirmishing before we've repopulated and reorganized enough to become an actual nation. Lothain Bluetusk leads the Order, mourning Corin and staying behind as many of the greatest heroes scatter to the wind. But we don't let that stop us, immediately taking the fight to some goblins and orcish warbands to seize their unsettled territories. Lothain leads from the front, and we prioritize taking back the abandoned districts of Castenath, accepting for now that there's very little we can do to dislodge the orcish occupation of the northern quarter for now. To Lothain's surprise, a great religious conclave is called to discuss what happened with Corin in Castenath. Although she's seemingly not a well-known figure in the West, the influential warbands and kingdoms of Escan see Corin as nothing less than a divine figure. It is proclaimed, after some debate, that Corin has ascended to join the Canorian pantheon, called the Regent Court. She will take the divine place of Agrados as god of war, though whether or not this redeems the fallen god is still a matter of debate. A few more years pass as we fight minor conflicts. The other adventurers are pesky and unfocused, seeking profit and loot where the Corintar seek to protect the lands from orcish raiders. We're forced to grit our teeth and bear it, while other adventuring bands rove through our territory and devastate the nascent settlements and villages we protect. After 20 years of fighting and expanding our protected territories, the Order of Corintar settles down and forms a state. Our borders are jagged, uneven. Lothain, now pushing 40, consolidates, prioritizing conflict with the orcs, but also finally making limited war upon other adventurers who threaten our realm. Dwarves, here to strip mine Escan. Mages, seeking to practice forbidden magics. They're both brought to heel in the name of a united and safe Corintar. In 1468, 24 years after the death of Corin, Lothain Bluetusk, a venerable old warrior now, looks across his order and the lands he now leads. He came here to head a band of adventurers, but now finds himself the patriarch of a religious order devoted to the woman he owed his life to. He had beaten back the Green Tide and established Corintar chapters all across eastern Canor. His friends had moved on in those years, and now there were very few left in the order he even knew by name. Lothain had done his duty, even as he mourned Corin and raised his children. It was time for him to settle down. A humble cottage in a forest that didn't yet have a name. For a bastard child sentenced to starvation in a dark pit, Lothain felt he'd done a pretty good job. Now, we're mostly going to time skip ahead around 30 years, but some important events happen on the way there. The Age of Adventurers slowly winds to an end in Escan. Although we are the first to settle down, all of our rival guilds follow suit. The process speeds up as word reaches Escan that the elven homeland, Elantir, has been rediscovered far to the west. No longer do restless farmhands yearning for a life of adventure pick up a sword and travel to Escan. Now they sail in their thousands to reclaim a lost continent. The result is that most of our peers find themselves on the back foot. Corintar is now large and developed enough to fight the orc tribes with a standing army. The other adventuring realms are not so lucky. Orcs find themselves with the upper hand for the first time in decades. We do what we can to help, fighting difficult wars to push back the orcs in our little pocket of Escan. With many losses, the Corintar strike back against the Bladebreaker clan, the ones who raised Lothain. Corin's circle had always accepted half-orcs, and even the occasional full-blood orc. Our Red Lady wasn't one who sought a cleansing war of any sort. Tasked now with the administration of hundreds of thousands of orcs within our borders, we choose to integrate them and accept their culture within our society, though sending missionaries to turn them off of their destructive hunt for the god Dukan. The other kingdoms, however, had no such positive intentions with the orcs. Desperate to rid themselves of their green undesirables and fund their wars, the other kingdoms begin capturing orcs, selling them as slaves to work the empty fields in distant Elantir. Finally, one last event occurs in our time skip. Word comes back from Elantir that would set the stage for the next part of our story. A mural was found illustrating the day of ashen skies, the day the elven continent shattered. The survivors carved something unmistakable into the stone. It was the god Castellos, the lead deity of the Regent Court, desperately attempting to halt the calamity. No matter how the mural was translated or interpreted, one thing was absolutely clear. Castellos had died on the day of ashen skies. For a millennia and a half, the Canorians had been worshipping a dead god. Panic spread across Canor. Should this be treated as a recent happening? Was it worth mourning a god so long deceased? And another question was on everyone's tongues. Who now led the Regent Court? For many, the answer was obvious. Castellos had a son, Adean, the god of chivalry. No doubt he was also the head of the Pantheon now, as he had been without our knowledge for so long. But a radical other theory began spreading like wildfire all across Escan. Adean, or whomever led the court, had failed Canor. Where was Adean when Castanor fell? Where was Adean when the Sorcerer King marched his armies right to the walls of Anbencost? Where was Adean when the Green Tide ravaged and destroyed the heart of Canorian civilization? It was time for one who had succeeded where Adean failed to sit the throne. It was time for Our Lady Corin to lead the Regent Court. The Corintar were naturally the first to adopt this new religion, and through our global chapters we soon begin to spread the Corinite faith all across the eastern half of Canor. To our surprise, one by one the orc tribes give up Dukan, and they convert to become devoted Corinites. They had come to see her as the one who liberated them all from a violent god. As time went on, religious clashes growing more common and an air of zealotry taking the order, it seemed as though Corin was making her move in the heavens. The sky darkened, unleashing a rain of blood that would not cease for 20 years. They would call it the Crimson Deluge, a time of religious strife all across the continent. It was Corin's war. It was the Second God's War. During these Red Years, the Koronite faith expanded rapidly under the guidance of the Order of Korentar. When the blood rains finally stopped and nothing of religious significance seemed to happen, the Regent Loyalists and the Koronites both had little choice but to accept the meaning. Korin's war would have to be decided by mortal armies. The Empire of Anbennar, more truthfully a collection of independent but loosely allied states, was split down the middle. The current emperor was Koronite, but the regressive Regent Court loyalists, backed by the mightiest Regent Court kingdoms, declared a continent-spanning war for supremacy in the empire. Korentar stood with the Emperor, and our gunpowder crusaders marched west to protect the faithful. The Regent Court were led by Gawed, the kingdom that had once fought alongside Korin at the Battle of Rottensteppe. After nearly a decade of fighting, and over 2 million dead in the Empire, the Koronite League sacked Castle Gawatin, and proclaimed that the Empire of Anbennar would be Koronite forevermore. And this is where I'm going to end the section about Korentar. There is so much more left in this game for these guys to do. We're ending this at the halfway point, in order to give you the opportunity to play them for yourself. Escan is still divided. Much of Canor yet follows the heretical Regent Court, and worse, a strange new religion, a monotheistic religion, has begun to grow in popularity, as the city folk tire of the warfare of petty, squabbling gods. And how will the religious order of Korentar react to the decline of magic and the growth of artificery? Can they survive the vicious Black Powder Revolution against the mages? But maybe, in time, with Escan united fully under Korin's red light, perhaps the ancient empire of Castanor can be reforged in an era of new gods and new machines. But there are so many other nations to play in this region as well, each with a radically different vision for the world. Some orcs wish to continue the green tide, others wish to live side by side, peacefully with humanity. There are rogue mages who would reform Escan into a new and industrialized Black Castanor, exiled Demirians seeking to put Lothain's son on the throne of Anbennar, even cat-worshipping adventurers who decided that Escan would kinda look a little bit better with pyramids, wouldn't it? The game presents Escan as a region rich with possibilities, and Korin's band of adventurers is but one of many. Before we go any farther, please take a second to like the video if you're enjoying it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe too. I'm William SRT, and I cover the video games that spin off from tabletop franchises, taking care to introduce you to the lore and tell you all the little tidbits of how the two industries affect each other. If that's your kind of thing, stick around, because I've got a lot more coming. I think we've had enough of humanity and the continent of Canor for now. Let's travel an altogether different direction. Now, in the last section, the elves kept interjecting themselves into the story. Elantir, a lost homeland, vast remnant fleets, isolated elf realms. The elves have a lot going on for them lore-wise. And we've only talked about the moon elves, those are the ones who landed in Canor. Down south, a second remnant fleet led by the elven Alexander the Great finally freed the humans of Bulwar from their monstrous overlords after thousands of years, and replaced them with elven overlords. Womp womp. Anyway, okay, the elves. To summarize the history of the elves, I'm cross-referencing a bit with the Black Powder Chronicles wiki, which was the original lore Anbennar was based on. It was supposed to be a book, but instead it became an EU4 mod. It's kind of shaky canon, so I'm mainly using it to estimate dates, the order in which events occur, and to fill in gaps where we don't have confirmed modern lore. After the mythological ages of gods, genies, giants, and dragons finally wound down on the planet, and more importantly, after they stopped burning everything down repeatedly, the first mortals finally got their day in the sun. The Dwarves, probably. Although, the exact order on who got their first empire is kind of in our unsafe lore department, so, you know, disregard. They might have been starting it around the same time. We'll get to the Dwarves. Right now, we're talking elves. We don't know a ton of specific details on the old elven empire, but we do know that they freed themselves from slavery to the dragons in the aftermath of the Gods' War. The elves would, over a period of millennia, become the predominant power on the planet. We call those elves that ruled the world the Precursor Elves. The Precursors ruled their massive continent, Elantir, plus also having outposts all over the rest of the world. This game is chock full of fun details to explore about the Precursors elves. They really had their fingers in just about everything. Play for yourself in basically any region of the world and you'll discover some insane thing they were up to. Here's a list of just a few of the projects they had going on to show you exactly how advanced a civilization we're talking about. Let's start with this one. They got annoyed with how many ghosts there were in the Far East, and they built mega temples to ghost bust an entire continent worth of spirits. They converted another entire continent into a lab where they invented Warforged, and then experimented to make several exciting flavors of Tarask. They had friggin' space travel and colonies across the stars. Yeah, we're really talking about masters of magic and science, capable of feats far beyond imagination. The Precursors were immortal, so for much of their known history, they were ruled by a great Precursor Emperor, Aldan, with his twin brother Ducaniel being the top general and the greatest magister. It was a golden age for a time, with Ducaniel defeating foe after foe for the Empire. Standing atop the world in greatness, the elves felt a need to grow inward. All elves were recalled back to the continent of Elantir for an age of self-reflection. Ducaniel, however, unwilling to abandon his conquests, defied the order with his army. An age would pass as Ducaniel fought with his beleaguered forces, while the rest of his ancient people remained home to perfect their society and their philosophies. Everything changed when the Dark Prince, soaked in the blood of his many enemies, returned to Elantir. He was changed somehow, more sinister. He soon took a perverted liking to his niece, the Princess of the Empire, and kidnapped her. A great civil war shattered the Precursor Empire as Emperor Aldan fought to free his daughter from the treacherous clutches of Ducaniel. The Empire was broken by the end of the War of Two, but Aldan came out on top, imprisoning Ducaniel in the darkest dungeons of the floating city that the Precursors prized as their capital. Although nearly godlike in power, Ducaniel's bonds were too powerful for even he to escape. In the dark heart of the dungeon, he prepared a ritual that would take vengeance upon a world that refused to bow to him. His followers seized the mechanisms of the city and sent it crashing to the very heart of Elantir. As the city died, Ducaniel among them, in one last bloody act, he channeled the souls into a spell of pure destruction. It was the day of Ashen Skies. Elantir broke into fragments, 1 billion elven souls wiped out in an instant. Those survivors who weren't killed in the initial blast found Elantir to be tainted with malevolent energy. The Precursors had lost their immortality, possibly by mere exposure to Ducaniel's spell. The very air of this place was now poison, and the survivors piled up on great ships to make for Canor and Bulwar. It would be only a few months' journey from the coast, but be it through fey trickery or the planar instability caused by the calamity, the fleet never arrived. The lore is left vague as to why the fleet sailed for 1,000 years before they would finally see land, but the best answer that I have seen is that the fleet ended up being trapped in the plane of water. When the Great Wander finally ended, it was the elf Munas Moonsinger who led the elves to Canor and led them to make war upon the Witch King of Black Castanor. And well, the rest is history. The elves integrated, and their blood intermingled and thinned, except in a few places. Ibavar is, of course, the largest and the most isolated of the elf realms. But there is one other elf realm that truly resists assimilation into humanity. A small but prosperous isle sits off the coast of Lensinor, a place called Venail. The lords here never gave up on their seafaring ways, scoffing at the pretenders of Laurent that fawn over the possibility that one of their grandparents might have had just a few drops of the elder blood. The Elves of Venail have one goal: not to conquer like the old Elves of Laurent, not to isolate like the secluded warriors of Ibavar, or grow wealthy like the White Port of Selmildor. No, it is the dream of every child born on Venail to set foot upon Elantir once more, to rediscover the lost home of the Elves. And that is who we'll be playing in this section. Let's rediscover a lost continent. Venail is isolated, as it always has been. Against our better judgment, we participated in the Lilac Wars on the side of Laurent. Although victorious, we didn't actually get very much out of these conflicts. Precious elven lives were lost for little more than Laurent's goodwill. A new prince has been elected since then, Aldarion. Because yes, we are a democracy here. Aldarion is not much of an administrator or a warrior, but he has rekindled the dream of Elantir. Under his guidance, we will find the homeland, and we will reclaim it for our people. The first bit of this game isn't going to be of much interest to you fine folks. We're teching up to unlock the exploration idea group so we can start the hunt for the lost continent. It's not impossible during these years that we could have snagged some territory in opportunistic wars, but honestly, my opinion is that that just slows us down from our real mission. So we're gonna pick back up in about a decade and a half. Venail's Age of Exploration begins in 1461. Calisander Seawatcher is our greatest admiral, but his duty is to watch our coasts. Instead, Alariandel, one of our oldest elves, takes to the seas to sail west. A fleet is put together, and after a long sail through empty waters, we find the lost coastline. Only a few short years later, we've sent the first colonists to the island chain leading up to our homeland. These isles are empty, barren of people. The largest one, larger than the greatest kingdoms of Canor, would come to be called Endraliande. The lands are so vast, and we elves are so few. And our explorers soon discover that this vast island is little more than the first stop on the way to an even larger mainland. Venail has always been a prosperous little island, but the wealth to accomplish a task of this size is far beyond us. The Dwarven Azra Bank isn't solvent right now, deep into their investments into Dwarven reclamation efforts. Instead, our prince sails to the city of Damescrown. We come to an agreement with the Imperial Bank. They'll give us a loan and funding for a period of 100 years, after which we will be required to start paying them back with the vast untapped wealth of Elantir. It's a deal with the devil, but we do need the funding. With it, we put a call out all across the continent. The elves of Canor are fading. Our blood thins, and our culture disappears and assimilates into human kingdoms. To preserve our way of life, the elves must go west. The elves must return to distant far shores. To fully commit to this goal, a second deal is made, this time to one of the Lensinori lords. They will give us wealth and assistance shipping elves across the sea. But once we've founded our homeland and moved our population, we will give them the Isle of Venail and all its riches. We land explorers on the main continent, a place we would name Noruin. A pathfinder named Lithiel is the first to land upon our birthright. The reports we get back are troubling. The terrain is one thing, endless white forests that bleed sap in the winter, but it was who lived in these blood groves that disturbed the powers that be on Venail. For centuries, we dreamed of returning home, a vast continent of elves rebuilding the Precursor Empire. The emptiness of Endraliande filled us with hope that our dreams and our stories would come true. But the ruin-born elves who inhabited the continent of Noruin complicated that narrative. There weren't supposed to be survivors here, and these elves don't resemble the precursors like we do. Centuries locked in with the chaotic magical energies of the broken continent had leached away their long lifespans and their innate ties to magic. The Ruinborn may look like elves, but our colonists felt they knew better. Even so, the sheer scale of the lost continent was becoming abundantly clear. Even if every elf on Canor could be convinced to settle Eiluntir, there would barely be enough elves to settle a small corner of it. We swallow our pride. The Ruinborn are at least elven enough to work the fields, while moon elves work the specialist jobs. And then, to the horror of all, the humans arrived. In dealing with humanity, accepting their loans and arranging for the transport of elves in human caravans, we accidentally sparked a wave of excitement. Second sons of nobles, peasants chafing under the nobility, and any who did not fit into Canorian society would travel across the seas. In a span of only a few months, dozens of adventuring companies made their landings, dividing up pieces of our continent for themselves. From the north came other colonial powers like Diran, hoping to slice off a piece of our homeland for their growing empire. This was naturally a great taboo to the Elves of Vanail, but also an incredible roadblock. Even with Ruinborn serving as our peasant class, we could never hope to be anything even approaching a majority on Eiluntir against the virulent hordes of humanity that were already building their towns and free cities. Our armies are small, so challenging these large adventuring companies became a foolish proposition. Instead, we took drastic action, first invading the Ruinborn tribe of Quinne and seizing their lands with Lithiel's heroic pathfinders. Then we did something that would have seemed unthinkable only a few short years ago. Eiluntir would be an elven continent. One day. But for now, we needed workers in the thousands, in the millions, and the adventurers of Escan, as it happened, had just such a workforce that they were looking to be rid of. Orcs were brought over as slaves, and any illusion that Vanail was building a righteous new world was shattered. One by one, the adventurers in the Bloodgroves and Eastern Trollsbay were brought to heel as our settlements pushed inland. The humans, unlike the others, were treated well. They shouldn't be here, not on our homeland, but we Moon Elves still owed much to their hospitality on Canor. The Isle of Vanail is abandoned, and we begin to reform into a true elven nation, based in the city of Aelnar. A standing army is raised, 12,000 human levies, and 30,000 elves. The impressive navy of Vanail is expanded, new white carracks hewn from Bloodgrove timber. And then came the administration. We are the heirs of the Precursor Empire, but the Precursor Empire was just that, an empire. Democracy was a thing we learned from the Demirians. It was not the Elven way. Our prince is crowned king, and a new world is proclaimed. We would call it Aelnar, a growing kingdom of elves straddling the Gulf of Ruin. This was our home, and in it we built great cities, marveling at the impossibly tall cliffs that rimmed our kingdom, the telltale fingerprints of Ducaniel's atrocities. But as our kingdom grew, the internal stability began to weaken. There were many who had different visions for Aelnar. Lithiel, the first elf on Noruin, seemed uncomfortable with the blatantly evil caste system that was growing. Cade, the old general, rejected the reform into a national military. Sikrekor, the marshal, planned on sacking the Trollsbay republics once and for all. Aelthanas, a demagogue who rejects the monarchy and wishes to return to a republic of the elves. And finally, Davar, a popular cleric who wishes to give Aelnar's caste system a divine backing. The factions are chafing, the Ruinborn are rioting, and our king is not up to the task. In a bloody night, he and the prince are murdered, left in a ditch. The king's closest advisor takes the throne, but he's not the man for the job, and he knows it. The first revolts begin, and he nearly breaks in half with anxiety as the army strikes into action. When Calisander Seawatcher, the mighty admiral, asks for the throne, it is given to him gladly. The other factions, one by one, begin to make their plays as anarchy spreads across the nation. They would back Seawatcher's government, if they could be appeased. If not, it would be war. The age of unraveling, the Rian Visa in Elven, had begun. Cade, furious at our compromises with Sikrekor's army reforms, was the first to break away. our nation begins to crumble, and Kalisander's regime controls little more than the forts and the fields just beyond them. Cade's rebellion is squashed just as the Ruinborn of Quina rise up. We don't have generals up to the task before them. Kalisander taps Lithiel in, allowing her to lead the armies despite their differences. With her at the helm, we easily crush Aelthanis' popular uprising. But Lithiel isn't taking it well. She came to Aelintir as a kind-hearted explorer, a hero. But men like Kalisander corrupted that dream, used it to hurt innocents and enslave the vulnerable. And now, even the promised prosperity had shattered due to the political games of these powerful men. Lithiel revolts, and this time we side with her. It's a tough rebellion. Secrecor reformed the Loyalist legions into a force called the Star Watchers, and they harried us every step of the way as we broke down the chain of forts blocking the capital from us. But in the end, Lithiel and her Pathfinders win. Kalisander's police state is cast down. Lithiel is able, after a few more years of conflict and revolts, to talk down Secrecor and Davar. She may never fully recover from the trauma of the Rian Visa, but after an awful war, Aelnar comes to a period of peace once more. But it's still not the kingdom she wanted. Aelnar was meant to be a warm and loving homeland, a place where she could proudly wander forever and never run out of soil for her feet to tread upon. She had won, but that did little to make the Moon Elves accept the Ruinborn. She ended the importation of orcs, but she didn't have the political control required to make the slave owners free the ones they'd already bought. Secrecor and his Star Watchers become an unstoppable war machine that begins their steady march west into Trolls Bay. Meanwhile, it was all Lithiel could do, just barely, to stay on top of the paperwork. The trauma of war, the stress and the guilt of managing what was rapidly becoming an evil empire was far too much for the heroic Pathfinder. Lithiel was headed for a mental break. In her darkest moments, another voice spoke to her. A voice more suited to run a kingdom like Aelnar. She called herself Elissa. The delusions reached a fever pitch. Lithiel could do nothing more but fight to contain the Dark Queen growing inside the recesses of her mind. And even this was too much. Her advisors found her on the edge of death, catatonic and slumped over in her chair. Days passed as they waited to see who would awaken, the hero Lithiel or someone else. In the end, the choice was taken out of Lithiel's hands. An assassin sought to use the chance to end Lithiel's life, and Lithiel died that day. And from her body, Elissa woke up, the Dark Queen for a dark empire. Her first act was a powerful blast of ice magic that impaled the assassin and collapsed the royal palace of Arca Ore. The Crystal Queen was here, and her dark witchcraft was destined to retake the continent. We will stop the story of Aelnar here. Once again, halfway point. Elissa has a dark empire to win for the Elves. She's got to prep for a showdown with the Fae-protected Ruinborn of Western Aelintir, a colossal battle king to defeat beyond the Cliffs of Ruin, and a sentient forest that hates us in southern Aelintir that will have to be burned down. But, much like with Escan, there's so much that could have happened instead. For starters, that civil war had a number of outcomes, and even a way to subvert it altogether. I mean, there's no path where Aelnar becomes a good place, but there are many different flavors of evil to choose from. But Aelintir isn't all evil. You can play as all those adventurers that we were scandalized by earlier on in the playthrough. You could become a Gnoll pirate republic. You could become the Trolls Bay Accords, aka the USA. We could even play as escaped orc slaves who become traders beyond the Cliffs of Ruin. Or we could play as the Ruinborn themselves, fighting in a never-ending crusade between the seasonal courts of Eordand. Or we could found a mighty battle kingdom up in the Innic Riverlands. Aelintir is just as dynamic as Canor, and the developers are adding more to it all the time. But now, let's move on to our third and final campaign. The Elves. A bit troublesome, aren't they? You might rather dislike them, and I mean that would be a fair thing to think. They are kind of the cause of like everything that has ever gone wrong in the world of Anbennar. And if you hate elves, you might actually have a lot in common with Dartaxis, a human rebel setting out to free Bulwar from elven control. Through the story of his nation, you'll defeat humanity's latest overlord, and humanity will be free to to once more be ruled by a god king. Why is Bulwar like this? But if you're an elf hater, you may also have a lot in common with the Dwarves. That's right, we have one last loose plot thread I want to cover before I leave you all to explore this world on your own. The orcs who attacked Escan in their vast green tide didn't come from nowhere. We gotta talk about the Serpent Spine Mountains, the lost home of the Dwarves.
And they call it a mine. A mine!
Tradition would have it that a two-headed dragon died during the Gods' War. Its first head, severed from its body, would become the Dragon Coast, and the place where the gnomes would build their great hierarchy. The other head, as well as the rest of the body, became the Serpent Spine Mountains. And let me explain the sheer scale of these mountains. We don't have any mountain range that's anywhere near the size of this thing in our world. The Andes are probably the closest, stretching the length of a continent. The Serpent Spine, however, is like if the Himalayas stretched all the way from western China to eastern Germany. It's nuts. This is an indescribably long mountain range. The first denizens to live in the caverns down here were almost certainly the goblins. But there's no recorded history of how they got there, or how long they were there for. When the dwarves came, the goblins were considered simply yet another monster in the depths. So where did the dwarves come from? It's actually quite a similar origin to the elves. The elves were slaves of dragons. Meanwhile, the dwarves had things a little bit better, being the servants of the gods. Helana, the primordial of Earth turned Earth deity, created them to be her craftsmen. It's likely she created them already within the Serpent Spine in a place called the Tree of Stone. Or that may just be where the dwarves entered the Serpent Spine. The Tree of Stone is considered the birthplace of the dwarven people, but what that exactly means is a bit open to interpretation. Nonetheless, despite having a better relationship to their masters than the elves, the Gods' War soon made conditions intolerable to the dwarves, and they had to flee deep underground to avoid the devastation. They began tunneling into the calcified dragon corpse, and they never stopped. They found a whole subterranean world down there. Not dark, empty tunnels, but a vast ecosystem of algae, insects, monsters, and goblins. All of it given life by the exhale of the goddess Helana, somewhere further down. It was there that the dwarves discovered gunpowder, built a rail network that extends across continents, and built the greatest cities that the world has ever known. This network, and all within, would come to be called the Dwarovar. They were lesser to the elven precursors, but not by much. And when the magical elven empire would eventually come to blows with the industrial dwarven empire of All Dwarov, it was not a particularly lopsided fight. This was a world-shaking war between equals. The two greatest mortal civilizations the world has ever known. Fortunately, the battle between enlightened equals was pretty gentlemanly, actually. The precursors sent their most gentle and chivalrous general who treated his foes with respect. I'm just kidding, they sent Ducaniel. The Elven Prince fought for decades to break through the hold of Hol Jorkad, a century of war just to get in through what amounted to the Dwarovar's sewers. Ducaniel fought hard, massacring dwarves in hopes of holding every hard-fought inch of Dwarovar territory. Despite it all, the Dark Prince twisted his knife in the side of the Underground Empire, pushing hard and splitting it down the middle. But then came the betrayal. An age of reflection. He was given the order to retreat to Elantir and give up the war he traded thousands of elven lives to win. But that was something he would never willingly do. To Ducaniel's horror, his army was cut off, and a band of obsidian dwarves soon shattered his lines with blood magic. Although the other dwarves exiled these witch dwarves for their foul sorceries, the deed was done, and Ducaniel's army began to disintegrate. He was pushed back to Hul Jorkad, and there the armies of Al-Dwarov took back the hold, level by level, until the prince and his honor guard were little more than prisoners in a single defensible position at the depths of the hold. But Ducaniel was the greatest mage the world had ever produced. This war would never end so long as Ducaniel lived. From the depths of his pseudo-prison, he toiled away with forbidden magics until he had created a soldier species of his own, doing what only the gods before him had done. The orcs were not born in Ducaniel's prison. That's simply where the spell was cast. Instead, the hulking warriors would appear in vast warbands, far behind dwarven lines. They were primitive, yes, but they were also strong, and they were everywhere in incredible numbers. He imparted one singular mission to his creations. He was their god, and they must free him. The orcs, though, would come to call him another name. Not Ducaniel, but Dukan. As the dwarven rail yards disintegrated, the various holds found themselves isolated and fending for themselves. Near overnight, the empire was gone, replaced with confused city-states surrounded by unfamiliar armies. They closed their gates and prepared for a siege that would never end. And so began the long fall of the dwarven empire. The holds would fight valiantly for their survival, but would be wiped out, one by one, over hundreds or thousands of years. A handful of these holds actually survived their sieges into the modern day, but so few. Famously, it was the fall of a hold called Kugdir that signaled the start of the Green Tide. The orcs would in time manage to free their god, but Ducaniel, in his arrogance, hadn't considered the possibility that the orcs wouldn't immediately consider him godly. Dukan couldn't be this tall, thin, pink thing with pointy ears. No, Dukan had to be an orc. His children turned upon him, but Ducaniel was able to escape with his life and return, defeated, to Elantir, where he would destroy that civilization as well. Womp womp. And that's the story of the dwarves, the orcs, and the elves, all mixed together into one. But the next part of the story would come when Korgus, who called himself Dukanson, massed the many orcish warbands together into one vast host to hunt for Dukan on the surface. But this created possibilities. Escan was destroyed, but the Serpent Spine had been emptied of orcs. Surface dwarves, exiled for thousands of years, began funding expeditions into the shattered halls of their ancestors. Remnant holds, knowing nothing of the world save for what lay within their axe-scarred walls, begin to send out scouts. We will take control of one such band of adventurers entering the Serpent Spine. But you may notice, based on the remaining runtime of this video, we won't be doing it in this video itself. In part, that's because this video is going pretty long on runtime, but it's also because this video has kind of a weakness. We've talked lore and we've talked in-game story, but we haven't really talked gameplay, have we? And there's a reason for that. It's a mod for an entirely different game. I'm here to tell you about Anbennar, not to tell you about Europa Universalis. That's like a whole different video. One for someone else. It has nothing to do with tabletop games. Don't bring up the board game. I don't want to talk about the board game. Anbennar is Europa Universalis 4, but better in basically every way. But if you decide to immerse yourself in this world, you probably need to familiarize yourself a little bit with the base game first. Anbennar is a fair bit more complicated than an already complicated game. With that in mind, I've decided that the best way to tell you about the gameplay of Anbennar and show you if it is right for you is just to show you the game. Flashing on screen right now is the time slot I've chosen for a stream, in which we will explore the Serpent Spine and reclaim the Dwarven homeland together. If you're watching this video after the stated stream time, then I'll have the VOD for the stream linked in the description below. So, why do I love Anbennar so much? I love it not merely because of its world building, but also because it's fantasy that has something to say. By spinning D&D into a period of transition, the transition between the medieval world and the industrial era, we get a hard and sometimes sobering look into how we think about fantasy. Yeah, of course the belief that greenskins are just monsters is gonna lead to war crimes and slavery. Why wouldn't it? Eilnar and Escan, working together, actually serve as a pretty good analysis of the evils of the colonial era, even when setting out with the best of intentions. Well, if I don't catch you at the stream, this has been Anbennar, the D&D fan setting where elves ruin everything. Is it worth buying Europa Universalis just to play it? Honestly, I say yes, but your mileage may vary, especially if you're a newcomer to the genre of grand strategy. You can always hop into their Discord instead and pick up all the homebrewed TTRPG materials that the community has made. I've also spotted that there seems to be an open application to a 5e game that looks like it's kind of a West Marches style game, so it needs lots of players. Applications look like they're still open, so get in there and see if you can arrange a game. And another thing, not to unleash a tidal wave here, but Paradox mods like Anbennar live and die through a constant flow of new developers of all skill levels. Never coded in your life, but you want to help write this world into being? Well, the mod team is very friendly, and they're no stranger to educating beginners into the fine world of Paradox coding. Are you inspired by the art of Anbennar? Again, you're wanted here. They've got a range of tasks for artists of all levels, from expert digital art for the big stuff to small icons for the mission trees. That said, recruitment isn't always open. There is actually kind of a hard limit on how many people can be on this team without overloading the testers and reviewers. I think right here, right now, they're closed to new applications, but head to the Discord and keep an eye out for if anything opens up. Thanks once again for watching. Please take a second to like the video if you haven't already. One last thanks to the dev team who made Anbennar. I love what you guys do, and now that I've got your attention, please, I would like you to rework Vern. They need to patrol their colonial empire with a professional Wyvern Corps. The fact that they are the colonial nation with an air force is what makes them unique. Let them make a hyper-fortified and developed Wyvern Corps HQ in each of their colonies. Give Vern a stacking trade protection and piracy suppression bonus for every one of those core bases that they own. Wait, why aren't you writing this down?